The air hung heavy and gray over New York City on that late October afternoon in 1899. It was a penetrating chill, damp with the promise of sleet, perfectly mirroring the grim determination in the faces of the women who had gathered. The cobbled streets were slick, reflecting the weak, hazy sunlight that struggled to break through the perpetual gloom. This was not a parade, it was a defiant march, a solemn display of force in a city and an age determined to deny them a voice. Leading the main column, stepping in near-perfect, synchronized rhythm, were the figures that would forever be etched into the movement's dark history, the three sisters of the Silent March. In the grainy photograph that would later become infamous, their presence is unervingly stark. They wore identical ensembles, long, severe black wool dresses, high-collared white lace chemisettes, and somber, wide-brimmed bonnets that cast their faces into shadow. This uniformity was a deliberate statement. They were interchangeable cogs in the machinery of change, sacrificing individuality for the collective cause. At the center was Eleanor Vance, the tallest and most outwardly composed. Her face, partially visible beneath the brim of her hat, held the detached calm of a seasoned military strategist. To her right marched Clara Bellamy, her expression sharper, marked by the fervent zeal of a religious convert. On Eleanor's left, Abigail Thorne possessed a quiet intensity. Her eyes seemed to look not at the crowd, but through it, fixed on some distant, inevitable future. They carried the core tenets of their radical fringe group. One banner read, "Votes for Women," but another, held between Clara and Abigail, bore the uncompromising demand that would haunt the investigation: deeds not words. As the procession moved from the relative quiet of the side streets onto the wider thoroughfare, the murmur of the crowd intensified, a mixture of curious onlookers, hostile detractors, and a few hesitant supporters. The gaslight flickered prematurely in the early darkness. In the moment this single photograph was captured, they were visible, resolute, and undeniably present. No one watching, however, could have known that in a matter of hours, this photograph would transition from a historical record of protest to a chilling piece of evidence, a final, tangible record of three women who simply and terrifyingly ceased to exist. They were marching toward their destination, but they were also, it seemed, marching straight into a profound and lasting silence. The moniker, the Three Sisters of the Silent March, was not self-applied, but rather bestowed upon them by the press, a title meant to sound both reverent and slightly menacing. They embraced it. Their bond was not familial but forged in the fire of shared outrage and radical commitment, making them, in many ways, closer than blood. Eleanor Vance, the intellectual anchor of the trio, was 32. She came from a background of quiet, comfortable respectability, the only child of a deceased, progressive lawyer. Her wealth provided the movement with vital funds and her keen mind provided strategy. Eleanor was the one who drafted their manifestos, who secured their permits, and who insisted on the uniform, somber attire. For Eleanor, the fight was a matter of legal logic and political siege. She planned every action with the cold precision of a general. Clara Bellamy, at 28, was the group's intense, burning conscience. She had been an elementary school teacher until she was dismissed for discussing socialist ideals with her pupils. Clara viewed the suffrage movement not just as a fight for the ballot box, but as a moral crusade, a way to cleanse society of its patriarchal sins. Her idealism bordered on fanaticism. She saw only black and white, right and wrong. When she spoke of deeds, she meant sacrificial, life-altering actions that would force the world to reckon with their righteousness. The youngest, Abigail Thorne, was barely 24. Her past was the most opaque. She had drifted to New York from the Midwest, bringing with her an almost unnerving sense of fervor. Abigail rarely spoke, preferring to communicate through fierce, unwavering loyalty to Eleanor and Clara. She was the implementer, the one who executed the more demanding, physical parts of their plans. Whispers within the movement suggested Abigail was drawn to the most extreme forms of protest, perhaps seeing violence or martyrdom not as a failure, but as the ultimate, necessary victory. Together, they formed a formidable, uncompromising unit, often distancing themselves from the more moderate suffragists. They believed polite appeals and tea parties were useless. Change, they felt, required a shock, a dramatic rupture. And as the October chill deepened that afternoon, the three sisters were preparing to deliver exactly that. The question was, to whom, or to what, was the shock truly intended? The banner held taut between Clara and Abigail, bearing the slogan, "Deeds not words," was far more than a rallying cry. It was a manifesto for violence, or at the very least, extreme, irreversible action. The phrase was a conscious rejection of the established, gradualist approach favored by mainline suffragist organizations, who emphasized petitions, polite lobbying, and intellectual debate. The three sisters considered their moderate counterparts weak, ineffective, and hopelessly naive. They believed that the public and the political establishment were deaf to pleas and arguments. To achieve the vote, they argued in their private, clandestine meetings, they must use an action so shocking, so profound, that it would shatter the public's complacency and force the issue into the national consciousness. In the weeks leading up to the October March, their rhetoric grew darker. In their rented room on Bleecker Street, illuminated by a single oil lamp, their discussions shifted from strategy to sacrifice. Eleanor, the pragmatic leader, began speaking of a necessary cost, while Clara, the idealist, used the language of martyrdom. Abigail, always silent, simply polished the shoes she would wear on the day of the march, her silence more unnerving than any spoken vow. The exact nature of the deed remained known only to them. They had hinted at a public spectacle, a symbolic destruction of some monument to patriarchy, or a strike against a prominent anti-suffrage figure. But the prevailing fear among their small circle of confidants was that the action might be directed inward. Their dedication was so absolute, so devoid of self-preservation, that some worried the ultimate deed they planned was the destruction of themselves, a final, theatrical disappearance meant to haunt the nation's conscience forever. As they marched down the street, their black dresses blending with the evening shadows, every firm step taken was a step away from polite protest and a step closer to the ultimate, undisclosed act. It was a commitment from which there could be no return. The march had proceeded for nearly an hour, a slow, grueling spectacle of quiet defiance. The jeers and shouts from the sidewalks were a low, constant pressure, but the three sisters remained unperturbed, their faces masked by their bonnets and their iron resolve. The appointed route required them to make a sharp turn from a narrower, cobblestone side street onto the formidable breadth of Fifth Avenue. This was the moment of maximum exposure, where the city's electric energy met the demonstration's somber drama. A young volunteer named Lydia Cross, marching directly behind them and clutching a small Votes for Women banner, would later provide the last reliable witness account. She recalled the atmosphere shifting dramatically as they approached the corner. The streetlights here were brighter, the crowds thicker, and a pervasive, unnatural fog, perhaps caused by the sudden drop in temperature combined with industrial smoke, began to swirl. It was as if they stepped into the gaslight, and the light consumed them, Lydia testified repeatedly, her voice trembling decades later. As Eleanor, Clara, and Abigail executed the turn, their black skirts swishing in unison, Lydia saw them continue for only a few paces down the avenue. A large, expensive, dark brougham carriage, the kind favored by wealthy bankers, had been idling near the corner. As the three women passed, the carriage suddenly lurched forward, momentarily obscuring the view of the marchers directly behind. The obstruction lasted mere seconds. When the carriage passed, Lydia expected to see the three distinct black figures continuing their forward momentum. Instead, the line was broken. Only the remaining banner-bearers were there, stepping over the exact spot where the sisters had been. Eleanor Vance, Clara Bellamy, and Abigail Thorne were gone. Lydia assumed they had simply ducked into the dense crowd or stepped aside for a moment. But a deep, cold knot of dread formed in her stomach. They were the leaders, the most disciplined, they would never break formation. They had not been seen stepping onto the sidewalk, nor were they visible further up the street. They had been swallowed by the corner, the fog, and the fleeting shadow of a waiting carriage. The disquiet began as a trickle of confusion at the suffragette meeting hall later that evening. As the exhausted damp marchers gathered for tea and debriefing, the central figures, Eleanor, Clara, and Abigail, were conspicuously absent. Initially, organizers assumed they had simply gone ahead to their shared lodgings to change out of their heavy marching clothes. They were known for their disdain of idle chatter and often skipped social functions. But as the hours dragged past midnight, the unease curdled into panic. A small delegation, led by the worried Lydia Cross, hurried to the sisters' shared rented rooms on Bleecker Street in Greenwich Village. The house was dark and silent. The landlady, a Mrs. O'Connell, grudgingly unlocked their door. The sight inside was immediately unnerving. The room, sparsely furnished but meticulously tidy, was exactly as the women must have left it that morning. On Eleanor's small writing desk sat her wallet, containing 2 crisp $5 bills. Beside it, her heavy keys to a deposit box were placed in a neat pile. Clara's favorite, well-thumbed book of poetry lay open, face down on her pillow, a bookmark inserted halfway. Most chillingly, Abigail's black marching coat, which she would never leave behind in the cold, was draped over the back of a chair. It was not the room of women who had fled in a hurry. It was the room of women who intended to be back for breakfast. The most perplexing object was found tucked beneath a handkerchief on Eleanor's desk, a folded, sealed, but unsent letter addressed simply to the committee. It was untouched, as if Eleanor had composed it, sealed it, and then, for reasons unknown, decided against sending it at the last minute, leaving it behind as a silent, cryptic message. The inescapable conclusion hammered the searchers. The 3 most dedicated and visible leaders of the movement had not run away. They had not been delayed. They had been intercepted, plucked silently and efficiently from the line of march, leaving behind everything but the clothes on their backs and the terrible mystery of their fate. The initial report of the vanishing was met not with urgency, but with thinly veiled contempt by the New York Police Department. The delegation of suffragettes who brought the news to the precinct house were viewed as hysterical agitators, not reliable witnesses. The case landed on the desk of Captain O'Malley, a man whose tenure reflected the deeply entrenched prejudices of the era. A staunch anti-suffragist himself, he saw the women's movement as a foolish distraction, a threat to the established order of home and state. 3 unmarried women walk off during a parade and leave their spare change behind? O'Malley scoffed to his sergeant. It's a stunt, I tell you. An effort to gain sympathy or attention for their silly ballot box obsession. He authorized only the most perfunctory inquiry. Detectives were sent to the Bleecker Street rooms, but they dismissed the untouched belongings as a carefully staged ruse. They interviewed the landlady, Mrs. O'Connell, who offered nothing but vague complaints about the women's odd hours and unfeminine intensity. The crucial testimony of Lydia Cross regarding the mysterious brougham carriage near the corner of Fifth Avenue was quickly discounted. O'Malley reasoned that in New York City, hundreds of dark carriages passed any given point hourly. Without a license number or description of the driver, the lead was worthless, or so he declared. The suffragette community, however, felt a cold certainty. The disappearance was not a stunt, it was a kidnapping or, worse, a political murder. They pleaded, they wrote letters, they demanded action. But O'Malley remained stubbornly unmoved. He saw the missing women as a problem that would solve itself, predicting that Eleanor, Clara, and Abigail would reappear within a week, chastened and eager for publicity. But as days stretched into a second week, Captain O'Malley's initial theory began to feel dangerously complacent. The silence from the 3 sisters was absolute, unnerving even to the cynical police force. The suffragettes, abandoned by the law, knew they would have to become the investigators themselves. With the official police investigation stalled by Captain O'Malley's inaction, the suffragettes initiated their own quiet, decentralized search. Lydia Cross, the last witness, felt a crushing personal responsibility for the disappearance and became the impromptu lead investigator. She returned immediately to the scene of the vanishing, the treacherous corner onto Fifth Avenue. The air was drier now, but the pervasive grime of the city remained. Lydia meticulously scoured the cobbled street and the base of the nearest building. She ignored the stares of passers-by, focusing on the dark recesses where the gaslight barely reached. Her search was painstaking, driven by a despairing hope. Finally, wedged between 2 paving stones, she found it. It was a single, long, black thread of coarse wool. It was distinct, unlike the finer fabrics worn by the average city woman. More importantly, it had a tiny, faded red speck woven into its structure, a detail Lydia immediately recognized. The banners carried by the 3 sisters had been sewn from salvaged materials. Tough, industrial canvas stitched with thick black thread. But the letters, votes, and deeds, had been outlined with a thin, crimson embroidery for emphasis. Lydia remembered Clara Bellamy, the idealist, arguing that the red symbolized the blood of sacrifice. This thread, pulled loose from the seam of a banner, or perhaps snagged from the hem of one of the heavy black dresses, was irrefutable evidence. It hadn't fallen, it had been pulled with force. The finding instantly shifted the focus from a voluntary walk-off to a violent, forced removal. But the thread's location offered another, subtler clue. It was found not in the middle of the street where the women had been marching, but closer to the curb, exactly where the idling brougham carriage had been waiting. This tiny piece of frayed wool was the movement's first proof of foul play, and the only thing connecting the sisters' last location directly to the possibility of an ambush. It was enough to reignite the desperate, unofficial hunt for the people who had dared to silence the marchers. With the discovery of the torn thread confirming foul play, the suffragettes immediately focused their suspicions on the most vocal opponents of their cause, the Anti-Suffrage League, a powerful, well-funded organization composed primarily of influential men and conservative society women. The League was no mere social club. It was a sophisticated political machine with deep ties to the city's most powerful bankers, industrialists, and political bosses. Men who saw women's suffrage as a direct threat to the labor stability and property rights that underpinned their fortunes. These men possessed the wealth to hire private detectives, procure silent carriages, and ensure the local police, specifically Captain O'Malley, remained compliant or, at the very least, indifferent. The most prominent target of their suspicion was Senator Charles Winthrop, a vocal critic of the suffrage movement whose speeches often descended into vitriolic personal attacks against the sisters. Winthrop had publicly stated, just days before the march, that these shrieking women ought to be given a ride out of town and a dose of humility. Lydia Cross attempted to follow this thread, approaching a retired journalist who had covered Winthrop's career. The journalist confirmed that the senator was in the city on the day of the march, staying at a luxury hotel only 3 blocks from Fifth Avenue. More tellingly, he revealed that Winthrop maintained a private stable of carriages and employed a dedicated, discreet security detail known for their heavy-handed tactics against labor organizers. While the evidence was purely circumstantial, the motive was ironclad. Silencing the most radical element of the movement would serve as a powerful warning to all other suffragettes. The disappearance would sow fear, discredit the entire cause as dangerous or criminal, and allow the powerful elite to continue conducting their business without the inconvenience of democracy. The question remained, was this a political kidnapping, or had the deeds not words philosophy provoked an ultimately violent, lethal reaction? The unofficial investigation pivoted when a nervous, elderly florist near Bleecker Street finally came forward. He had been terrified of approaching the police, but the continuous, quiet questioning by the suffragettes proved more persistent than any official inquiry. He recalled a peculiar event that had occurred just 2 evenings before the fateful march. He recounted seeing Eleanor Vance meet a man under the cloak of deep dusk, just outside the dimly lit bakery. The man was unlike anyone typically associated with the suffrage movement. He was neither a laborer nor a bohemian intellectual. He was impeccably dressed in a tailored, dark overcoat and a silk top hat, his manner suggesting considerable wealth and authority. The florist only caught a few fragments of their hushed conversation. He heard Eleanor say, with notable firmness, "The details must remain concealed until the deed is done." The man's response was a low, urgent murmur, punctuated by the single, chilling word, protection. The meeting was brief, lasting no more than 5 minutes, and they parted ways without a handshake or acknowledgement, melting back into the gaslight fog. This testimony introduced a vital, complicating factor. The sisters might not have been merely victims of the Anti-Suffrage League. This man was clearly an ally or, at least, an accomplice to their secret plan. His appearance suggested a connection to the very financial and political circles they publicly railed against. Was this man part of a highly placed, secret network funding a more radical agenda? Was the protection he offered related to the ultimate deed they planned? Or, more ominously, was he an agent of their abduction, perhaps using the pretext of an alliance to lure them into a trap at the corner of Fifth Avenue? The nature of Eleanor's clandestine meeting suggested a double life and a secret pact, one that likely explained the meticulous organization of their disappearance. The search, previously confined to the labyrinthine streets of Lower Manhattan, suddenly expanded across the water. The shift in focus was prompted by an aging ferryman who worked the late-night run from the Battery to Staten Island. Like the florist, he only spoke up after repeated quiet assurances from Lydia Cross that his identity would be protected from the police. The ferryman recalled the night of the disappearance, a particularly foggy, miserable evening. He distinctly remembered a dark, closed carriage being the last vehicle to board the 1 a.m. crossing. Carriages were not unusual, but what followed was. Just before the gangplank was raised, 3 women, completely encased in long, dark coats and scarves, emerged from the carriage's interior and hurried aboard the main passenger cabin. Their hurried movements suggested they were either desperately late or intensely eager to avoid being seen. The ferryman didn't see their faces, but their build and height matched the descriptions of the sisters, especially the severe, purposeful manner in which they carried themselves. He also noted that the driver, a large man with a closed-off demeanor, was paid an unusually generous fare by one of the women. She didn't speak, simply pressing the crumpled bills into his hand. This testimony provided the first indication that the disappearance was not a static abduction to a nearby safe house, but possibly the initial phase of a calculated flight. If the women boarded the ferry, they were heading for the less developed, more remote properties of Staten Island, or, potentially, using that route to continue their journey south or west, disappearing into the vast anonymity beyond New York. The key mystery remained: were they being forcibly transported against their will, or were they willing participants in their own vanishing, executing the ultimate, silent deed, not words that required them to abandon their lives for the cause? The ferryman's sighting suggested methodical planning, regardless of who was driving the carriage. The focus of the suffragettes' investigation returned to the cold, quiet room on Bleecker Street, specifically to the sealed, unsent letter addressed to the committee. This was Eleanor Vance's final, silent message, and it contained not an explanation, but a profound complication. The letter was brief, written in Eleanor's precise, unwavering hand. It did not mention the march or the exact nature of their upcoming deed, but it was fraught with internal conflict. It read, "The cost is greater than anticipated. C remains fervent, but I see now the price of the ultimate truth will demand more than the committee ever sanctioned. If we are forced to proceed, know that the path was chosen by the necessity of irreversible action, not by choice of self-preservation. When the silence comes, accept it as the fulfillment of our covenant. Our existence must become the proof of our principle. Do not follow us." The message was a stunning revelation. It confirmed the 3 sisters were involved in a pre-planned, secret operation that was directly connected to their ideology of deeds, not words. But it also suggested a sudden, last-minute escalation, an unforeseen demand that had been placed upon them, pushing the plan beyond its original scope. The chilling phrase, "the cost is greater than anticipated," implied that something had changed drastically between the moment Eleanor penned the letter and the final moments before the march. Had the mysterious man issued an ultimatum? Had the deed evolved from a protest into a political sacrifice? Crucially, the warning, "Do not follow us," suggested 2 things. Either they feared pursuit from their enemies, or they feared intervention from their own allies. The sisters' vanishing was intended to be permanent, a powerful, silent testimony achieved through their own self-imposed, absolute silence. If they were willingly executing this extreme covenant, then the search was not for missing women, but for the location of their chosen martyrdom. The severity of the unsent letter, particularly its references to a covenant and a committee, fueled a troubling theory among the remaining suffragettes. Eleanor, Clara, and Abigail were not just part of the mainstream movement, they belonged to a hidden society. This wasn't a society of polite political discussion, but a radical, deeply secretive faction born from the remnants of older, more militant causes. Perhaps a cell of former abolitionists who had turned to anarchism, or a group dedicated to the revolutionary politics sweeping across Europe. Their core belief was simple: the established system was rotten to the core and could only be overthrown through symbolic, profound acts of disruption. This hidden society would have provided the planning, resources, and, most importantly, the ideological framework for the ultimate deed. They likely viewed the fight for the ballot box as merely a step toward a larger, more comprehensive social revolution. The disappearance itself, in this context, was not a failure but the intended climax of their political statement. The key figure in this theory was the mysterious man from Chapter 9. He was likely the representative of this committee, the one who dictated the final, devastating terms of their covenant. His protection was not a safeguard against their enemies, but a guarantee of their complete isolation and silence, ensuring their sacrifice would have the maximum long-term haunting effect on the public. If this theory held true, the search was fundamentally flawed. The sisters hadn't been kidnapped by their enemies, nor had they fled from their cause. They had simply transitioned from public activists to silent martyrs, absorbed by a shadowy organization whose existence required their total erasure from the public record. They had given up their names and their lives to become a legend, a perpetual, nagging question mark in American history. The vague testimony of the ferryman, Chapter 10, provided the only viable geographic lead: Staten Island, and by extension, the entire, less developed expanse of Long Island. The suffragettes pooled their limited funds and hired a discreet, private inquirer, a former Pinkerton agent named Silas Reed, to follow the trail. Reed quickly established a chilling possibility. A few days after the disappearance, an isolated property on the north shore of Long Island, owned by a holding company tied to Senator Winthrop, the anti-suffrage suspect, had seen unusual activity. Local farmhands reported a late-night delivery and the digging of a trench, followed by sudden, complete silence. Driven by the horrific possibility of a clandestine burial, Reed managed to secure access to the desolate acreage. Under the cover of a freezing night, armed with shovels and lanterns, he and Lydia Cross found the disturbed earth in a remote section of the field. Their despair turned to horror as they unearthed what appeared to be the contents of a shallow, hasty grave. Yet, when they finished the grim work, the findings were confusing and macabre. 3 distinct mounds of freshly cut black wool fabric, heavily weighted with stones, had been buried. Alongside the fabric, they found 3 small, smashed oil lamps and a handful of singed wood, as if a small fire had been purposefully extinguished and then buried. There were no bodies. The discovery was a devastating misdirection. It was a clear, theatrical gesture designed to look like a hasty burial, calculated to mislead searchers into believing the worst, only to find nothing but empty shrouds. This gravesite was a message, expertly crafted by those who understood both fear and symbolism. It suggested that the perpetrators, whether they were the Anti-Suffrage League or the sisters themselves executing their final deed, wanted the world to believe the women were dead, but did not want to leave physical proof. The sisters had become ghosts, their existence officially over, their voices replaced by an ominous, unsolved silence. Desperate for a new angle after the devastating Long Island deception, Lydia Cross returned to the only tangible link the sisters had left behind: the haunting black-and-white photograph taken moments before their disappearance. She stared at it for hours, magnifying the already grainy image with a powerful jeweler's loupe. Everyone had focused on the 3 central figures and their powerful banners. But Lydia began to scan the periphery, searching for anomalies in the gas-lit shadows. In the far background, positioned near a dark carriage parked on the right, stood a cluster of figures. Most were indistinct, but one figure, a man in a bowler hat, seemed to be looking directly at the camera. He was the man closest to the curb where the missing banner thread had been found. Lydia zoomed in relentlessly on his gloved hand. The detail was faint, almost imperceptible, but there it was. The man was holding a simple, unlit cigar, but he wasn't looking at it. His thumb and forefinger were extended in a deliberate, sharp, downward gesture. It was a form of communication known only to a few select groups, a signal. It was not a recognized signal of the police or the Anti-Suffrage League. However, a retired anarchist sympathizer Lydia consulted identified it immediately. A centuries-old, clandestine symbol used by secret societies to confirm a pending transaction or extraction. The signal meant, simply, the package is secured, proceed with the transfer. This tiny detail changed everything. The man was not a random bystander. He was an operative. The brougham carriage that briefly obscured the sisters was not a coincidence. The entire event was a meticulously orchestrated extraction conducted by the hidden society. The 3 sisters had not been abducted, they had been escorted out of their public lives. They were not dead, but they had agreed to a life of perpetual secrecy to fulfill the terrible demands of their ultimate deed. The photograph captured the precise, chilling moment their public identity was willingly and absolutely severed.